This podcast is part of the Big Heads Media Podcast Network. Go to bigheadsmedia.com for more great podcasts.
Hello, Cardinal fans. Welcome to the 10th episode of the St. Louis Cardinals Unrestricted podcast. This is your host, Christian May Suzuki. And man, what a terrible couple of weeks for the St. Louis Cardinals. You know, I didn't do a podcast episode last week, which I apologize for, but would you really hear me or want to hear me just complain more and more about the Cardinals? Because that's all they've really given us. Now, there have been some few bright spots that I'd be remiss not to mention, but as I'm sure you guys know, being under 500 now, rough last couple of weeks, not being able to hit, not being able to pitch, it has not been fun being a Cardinal fan. But looking at a bright side, and one that I'm very, very happy to see, is the reemergence, per se, of Paul Goldschmidt. Now, I have been bagging on him for the start of the season for quite a while, and he so far has stepped up. In June, he's hitting 306, 368, 548, hitting the ball hard. His walk rate is still kind of low. I would prefer him to see the ball a little bit better, but he is seeing the ball, and that he's making good contact, and he's hitting the ball hard, and he is striking out a little bit too much, but I can't really complain. It's hard to complain with a 306 average and very, very solid power with the way the Cardinals have been playing recently. And, of course, there's been Tyler O'Neill as well. He hit 15 home runs in his first 161 at-bats after just 12 in 290 in 1920. Now, he obviously hasn't picked up a home run since then, but he's also worked on improving his walk rate. He's been drawing more walks, been seeing the ball a little bit better, and he's been a little bit more patient on those 3-ball counts. It seemed like he was seeing the ball well for the most part. It's just those 3-ball counts, it's almost like he was expecting a pitch in the zone and was guessing and just got too antsy and would swing at these bad pitches that he would see before. But it just seemed like he would get to the 3-ball counts and just wouldn't be able to finish it through. But now it seems like he's, in a way, put it together. He didn't draw his third walk until the 40th game of the season, but since then he had 3 walks in an 8-game period, and he's had 6 walks in the last 15. So the question is this a sign of growth, or is just the law of averages and someone just coming back to the mean? And I do think it's a sign of growth. I think that he is one guy who has been steadily getting better at seeing the ball, in particular seeing breaking pitches, and I think applying that patience on 3-ball counts has finally allowed him to draw a little bit more walks. On top of course, just the fact that he's been incredibly threatening, and teams are incentivized to pitch around him with how bad the rest of the team has been. On to the bad stuff, I guess, unfortunately. Well, I guess this is sort of in the middle. Now, when we look at All-Star voting this year, it was pretty poor turnout for the St. Louis Cardinals. No one really came particularly close to really making it. And the one real, honestly, biggest takeaway that I can see is that Tommy Edman ended up with more votes, or hung around with more votes for a while, than Colton Wong. And obviously Colton Wong was the second baseman previously for the Cardinals, whereas Edman is the heir apparent. But when you take a look at their numbers this year, it's not that radical. The difference isn't particularly as large as I expected, to be honest with you. When we gave up Colton, I was one of the very, very unhappiest of people, in part because I honestly didn't think that Edman had the pop to stick around the majors. I get that there are contact hitters that exist that don't need pop, but you do need some certain amount of oomph to get contact hits, to get hard hit balls into the outfield, to get liners, to get hard grounders. You got to hit the ball hard. And it's not all about hitting the ball hard, but there was a point where I just didn't think that he had anything more than a wet noodle, and that just wasn't going to work at some point. And he surprised me. He's done a lot better than I've expected. It's definitely something that can be built upon. 264, 308, 380 right now is definitely something that can be improved upon, and might not be the numbers you're looking for in a leadoff hitter right now. But it isn't that much worse than Wong, who hit 285, 344, 453. Obviously there is a little bit of a difference there in terms of the production, but when you're also thinking about the money, it really isn't that bad when you really break it down in terms of value per dollar. Now, the other side of that, of course, is defense, because one of Wong's biggest attributes was his defensive prowess. Of course, when he was on the Cardinals, many fans, myself included, called him the best defensive second baseman in the league. And I'm still pretty much of that opinion. Now, when you look at the defensive numbers, the big defensive stats that people like to throw around and people use, and that really are generally the best ways to analyze defenses. You have Edman at a 3 DRS, which is defensive runs saved, if you don't know, in 386 innings at second, and a negative 1.7 UZR, which sounds bad, but it's not horrendous, and I'll tell you why later. Now, when you're looking at Wong has a 5 DRS in 351 innings at second and a 1.5 UZR. So he's been obviously stellar. He's been one of the better defensive second basemen in the league, as we mentioned before. But is the difference really that radical? It's not really as big as we think, and here's why. So when we break down UZR, it started tracking in 2002. There are 3 sort of big metrics that it uses to value infielders. There's the range metric, range runs. There's the double play turning metric that measures how well you are at successfully turning double plays, the DP runs. And then there's the error metric, which how many runs you've saved off of errors in comparison to your compatriots. When you break down the Colton Wong versus Edman, you start with the range runs. It's 0.7 for Wong and then negative 0.7 for Edman. Now, with an average of about 0.46 among second basemen, just ever, it's not particularly terrible, especially when you look at the differences between the highest and the lowest, the peaks. So the highest ever for an infielder was 23.7 from 2002 Adrian Beltre. And fun fact, 2007 Albert Pujols is 7th with a range metric of 21. So when you're thinking 23.7 for Beltre, 21 for Pujols, and then the lowest ever for an infielder is Michael Young at negative 23.4. So those numbers, 0.7 and negative 0.7, don't really seem like a big deal when you really think about it in that respect. And even if you narrow it down to just second baseman, the highest ever for a second baseman is 19 from 2008 Chase Utley, and then the lowest ever is negative 16.5 from 2005 Robinson Cano. Again, when you compare 0.7 to negative 0.7, really doesn't seem that big of a deal in retrospect when you have these huge ranges that you can get at in this particular stat. And of course, again, the average is 0.46. So it seems like, generally speaking, Wong has been a little bit above average, where has Tommy Edman been below average? Maybe. Does it seem like it? It certainly doesn't in terms of just watching the eye test, but let's go with it. It doesn't seem like that radical a difference, but let's go with let's go with it. That's fine. Now, when you go to the double play metric, again, it goes to Wong, but it's another very, very small difference. It's negative 1.2 to negative 1.7. Again, very, very small difference. Now, the ranges aren't as drastic, and this is a good stat in that the average second baseman hangs around about 0. So it's actually easy to sort of measure. The highest ever for second baseman was 2012 Dustin Pedroia at 4.9. So round 5 is the cap. And 2009 Jimmy Bartlett was negative 4.2. So again, negative 5. So 5 to negative 5 or so. Again, negative 1.2 to negative 1.7. It doesn't seem like a particularly huge margin when given the big range. But of course, it's definitely not as significant as the range runs. And obviously they're both negative here, and it's hard to really break down exactly what this metric is. But again, it's another thing we just have to go with. They were slightly below average at turning double plays this year in comparison to the rest of the troop of second basemen among the years, and we just keep on moving along. Now, the third metric is error runs. Now, this is where Wong has the really large advantage because he hasn't committed an error yet. So he currently gets 2.0 points to his UZR from the error metric, whereas Edman, who's committed 3 errors, only gets 0.4. So with this one, again, the range is a little weird. It's again, the average is around 0.45. So, Edman is sitting around average for second baseman. And, of course, Wong is certainly above average there, and he's doing well, not committing those silly small errors on small time plays that we were so used to, and that was the one big flaw in his game. But the highest ever is just 6.1 from 2009 Placido Polanco, who had just 2 errors in 1,289.1 innings. And Eckstein had that year the same, just 2 errors in 1,093.1 innings, but a much lower error metric simply because he had much fewer opportunities. So while these metrics can be hard to really understand, and the math seems very complex, very stacked, and almost unnecessarily excessive, it is that way because there are so many different factors that you really need to compact down and sort of make literal, things like those opportunities that you just normally wouldn't think about and normally don't consider when you're talking about players and errors. And fielding opportunities isn't really something that's mentioned very often, but it's something that you have to consider when talking about fielding, and that's what UZR and DRS and all these things really bring down to the end of the day. So what's the big difference between Wong and Edman then? Well, the big difference is, I guess it's better to start this with a saying. The best ability is availability for any sport. And that is what Tommy Edman has given to the St. Louis Cardinals. And boy, has it been valuable because of how unfortunate the injuries have been for the Cardinals. Now, 70 games for Edman to 47 for Wong is really the big difference. It results in 77 hits for Edman to just 49 for Wong, 18 doubles for Edman to just 12 for Wong, and then Wong is a bit up in the homers simply because, like I said, Edman doesn't quite have that pop. So the question is, the Cardinals, are they happy with what they've done? Was getting rid of Wong the right move? Was moving on and allowing Edman to take that second base spot end up being a good idea simply because of the value that you bring with it? Tough to say at this point. But so far, the Cardinals having faith in Tommy Edman has really paid off. Now, the question that will always linger is, if you could put Edman or Wong at short, assuming you can keep both of them in last offseason, and you can get rid of a Paul DeJong or keep him off the bench or do something along those lines, would that not have been better? Because I think people are starting to realize that Paul DeJong is not that guy. He really isn't. He had some big error last week that essentially blew open a shutout and lost us the game. And I saw a tweet that basically said, "Never have I seen the Cardinals fan base turn on a player quicker than Paul DeJong." And my response to that is, it's probably deserved, because dude is not that good. He had some power and he was putting up some homers, but you watch him pit at bat and you've watched him over the past 5 seasons, it hasn't really gotten much better. He's just the same guy, making the same mistakes, not seeing the ball well, not making good contact, striking out an abhorrent amount. Even, obviously not as much as O'Neill, but it sure feels like it. And if he's making errors like that too, it's not good. And it really just has not worked out for him so far this year. And the fact that he was hitting 4 and 5 and protecting the most important hitters in the lineup was just a travesty for Mike Schilt. It was a travesty. And him sitting at 7 and 8 is probably where he should end up sitting for the rest of the season, if not seasons ahead, because if we're going to keep him, he'd be a really good 8 hitter with that kind of power, but that's all he can be at this point. He just does not have it. And I really do think about sometimes, I get that Wong hasn't played the position and Edman's arm just is not fit for shortstop. But I always do wonder what might have happened if we were able to keep both of them and use them as the infield duo, because Paul DeJong is, I think, just on his way out. He's just not that guy. He's not the guy that we're looking for moving forward, and unless we can build a stellar team around him and let him, as I said, serve as a plus defender, hopefully, if he can get that back together, with a power upside, but serving as an 8 hitter, then that would be fine. But other than that, it's not going to work out. He's not going to be a core hitter on a championship team. And if that's what the Cardinals are expecting, then that's just going to be a big problem. It's not going to work out. He's really showing it this year with, you might argue, a struggle or a slump, but I would argue is just, yes, it's a slump. But it's not as big of a tank as you might imagine. This is closer to the type of hitter that he really is. And he might be able to bring it back up into the low 2s, and he might be able to hit a couple homers, but he is not a guy that you can serve as a core hitter. And I think that it's good to find that out now more, as opposed to later, so we can figure it out before the window on guys like Goldie and guys like Yachty close, which is going to happen very, very soon. Now, turning to the staff, there's an obvious need for a pitcher and a trade. And unfortunately, a lot of the guys that I mentioned previously all went down and got hurt. It's a shame. They're not necessarily large injuries, but Boyd is being shut down until after the All-Star break, and Gray is still in the air. It's not great. Obviously, there's guys like Fulton Awish who are still healthy, but those are sort of the lesser targets that I was hoping for. Now, those targets were all slated as inning eaters, 5 slots, those kind of players. And I had mentioned that it's difficult to look for a big splash unless you can find a guy who you can really trust alongside Jack Flaherty for a significant period of time. And while I didn't think there was exactly someone who fit that profile before, there is definitely a player that's coming out and emerging as that kind of guy. And that's Jose Barrios. The big reveal is that Barrios and the Twins aren't really talking an extension, which I feel is just criminal because I think he's a great pitcher. He's got a very loopy curveball. He's got a sharp fastball. Got a good balance of between the pitches and a good changeup to go alongside it. I think that is a guy at the young age that he's at. If we can sign him to a decent deal after a year of arbitration, I think that's a guy that you can actually put forward a few prospects and actually try and really make a dive for him, because that's a guy who's a young guy with great stuff and decent numbers in the AL that will adjust to the NL, that will establish him as a very solid number 2 pitcher beside Jack Flaherty. I mean, a Jack Flaherty, Barrios rotation, that would be the start of a good core. That would be the start of a very talented core that you could build around. And it seems like the Twins are just not in a position where they want to bring him back. They've been struggling, and he hasn't been honestly performing up to his talent. His numbers are decent, but he's not performing up to his talent, I don't think. And going to a pitcher-friendly park and switching to the NL and coming to the Cardinals, I think would be a perfect situation for him, perfect situation for the Cardinals. And I really think that is now the guy that I would want them to go for at this point, because he's the only guy that really has that number 2 potential for a long term. Even a guy like Max Scherzer, it's hard to say when the Cardinals would even look to him at this point. If he's just going to be a rental with the way the team is performing now, there's no point if all he's going to do is turn you from a team that's missing the playoffs to a team that's a middle-of-the-road playoff team but gets knocked in the CS or even the DS. And there's no point in that. We have to look for the window. We have to look for the opportunity within that window. It's not just about tomorrow. It's not just about the next day. It's about the window that we have with Goldschmidt, the window that we have with Arenado, and the window that we have with the core players. And yes, Yachty is definitely a question mark. You definitely want to take that 1 year at a time. And Knizner isn't 100% ready to really take that helm yet, especially with just what Yachty means to this team as a whole and what he has done as a leader of pitcher, as an enforcer on the base paths, and as arguably the best defensive catcher of all time, as I've talked about. So it's not just about this year. It's not just about next month. It's not just about next year. I would like to see it next year, of course, but we have to think in a grander scope and a wider scheme. And I think that Jose Barrios is a guy who covers all those bases, who is that number 2 guy for the next 5-6 years alongside Flaherty, that you can really build a championship core in around 2 to 3 years with all the guys that we have coming up, the Tyler O'Neills who are playing well, and the Oviedo who might come up together, the Hicks and the Reyes who hopefully will develop as more experienced, more controlled members of the bullpen, Cabrera, Gallegos. We have a lot of young guys, as much as is emphasis on these older players. So it isn't just about this year. It isn't just about next year, as I said. And as great as Scherzer would be, cool as it would be to see Scherzer in a Cardinal uniform and watch him play for his hometown team, we got to think the bigger picture. Because if he doesn't sign back and it's just a one-year rental and this team gets booted in the DS, then it's just a whole big waste of time. And it would be sad, and we would be breathing down Mo's neck, even though we clamored for it, and that just wouldn't be cool. Because Mo deserves all the criticism that he gets for the surrounding moves outside of the blockbuster moves, for the way that he looks at certain talent, the way that he latches himself on to guys being paid money, or guys who, quite frankly, who pitch left-handed and are really bad, because, you know, we've had plenty of those in the world, and Tyler Webb definitely outstayed his welcome as far as I'm concerned. So at this point, it's about moving forward, and it's about the bigger picture, and John Mozeliak and crew needs to think about that, because right now this team does not look like it's one piece away from making a run. It looks like it's one piece in every facet of the game, maybe, but certainly not just one piece away. And that's the kind of thing that you need in order to trade for a guy like Max Scherzer. And that's not happening right now. So again, Berrios, that's the guy right now. That's the guy who, at this point, if he's available, you can get him for a decent value, and, you know, you can keep him around because of his control and because of his age. That's a guy that, if you have to throw some prospects in that you do really value and that you might regret losing, that's still something that you might want to do, because his talent is undeniable. It's there. Whereas the minor league players is still developing. And right now, having a guy to pair alongside Flaherty is imperative, with Wainwright retiring, with Carlos Martinez being Carlos Martinez, and with no real answer as a number 2 starter at this point, or even really a number 3. It's been quite a difficult road, and, you know, hopefully the signing of LeBlanc will help curb things a little bit, but that's a very, very low reward type of move, and not one that's really going to improve the team as much as it is just going to really just eat innings. The guys that I mentioned, the Grays and the Boyds, yes, they were inning eaters, but they also would be decent inning eaters. They wouldn't be these mediocre guys who you're just throwing out there to throw 180 innings with a 5 ERA. Because if you're going to do that, just throw out Oviedo. Just let him go. Just let Martinez go, because there's no point. You just keep the 5-man. You make sure you have a 5-man rotation, and just, if you're going to do that, just don't even worry about Scherzer. Just look for Berrios, and if you can't do that, just look for next year, because if that is the extent of the moves that's going to be made to try and get this team back on track, it's basically the lowest hanging fruit, lowest common denominator, lowest impact move that you could possibly make. And if that's what the mindset's going to be, then it's clear that they're just looking to next year and they're looking forward. And quite frankly, that with the way that this team is playing, as empathetic as the division may be, that's fine. You don't want to be that team that makes it because your division was bad. It's not a good feeling. It really isn't. As a Bucks fan, I can tell you, when we were still in it, 12 games in the season with just 2 wins, it was a funny feeling. But I can tell you that those guys at the top at 7 and 9 were not feeling happy at all. And when they got mollywopped out of the playoffs, it was sort of a given, because they simply made the playoffs off a bad division and not necessarily off the merit. Is that what we want from the Cardinals? Is a playoffs appearance just a good enough consolation prize for the season? If it is to you, then hey, be it by all means, but it certainly isn't to me. And I think that we have to make moves to really build towards a championship team and build a team that doesn't just make the playoffs because the rest of the division loses, and the rest of the division is allowing us to stay in pace despite being under 500, because that's just not something that you want to aspire towards. You want to be successful. You want to fight through adversity. You want to be tested. And barely surviving through barely over 500 division is not going to test you and not going to get you prepared for a 5-game series with a very talented squad, because that's what the playoffs are. They're full of very talented squads, and you have to be ready for that. And if you're banking on getting through with a win over 500, or however bad this division is going to end up being, then what's the point? What's the point? Why aim so low? Because no one's going to remember that, especially for a team like the Cardinals. No one's going to remember just a playoff appearance and a first-round loss, or even a championship series run. It's just going to be dust in the wind with the fact that we all knew in our heart of hearts that the way this team is playing right now, if it continues to play like this, or even improves mildly and still makes the playoffs, even if they played around the peak at what they were playing, it's just not enough. So it remains to be seen what the Cardinals do, if they do anything. But if the play does not improve, then there is no reason to make trades for this season, and there's no reason to not look forward. So anyway, thank you guys so much for listening. I know that there's one topic in particular that I didn't really get to, and that's the sticky ball controversy. And we'll get to that next week. I think with the enforcement and with everything going on now, I think we'll have more data and we'll have more of an idea of how this is going to work and how it's going to feel. So that's when we'll dig a little bit deeper into that. But anyway, thank you guys for listening, and look forward to seeing you next Tuesday. Go Cardinals. As bad as they've been, go Cardinals.